it's a much smaller one in a way. I mean, a large organization in Turkey in the 1970s, Devrimci Yol, and but in specific in a very small city of Fatsa. Against all odds, an innovative democratic experiment took place at the end of the 70s in Fatsa, a small city on Turkey's Black Sea coast, 300 miles northeast of Ankara. After his 1979 election, the city mayor, Fikri Sönmez, popularly known as Fikri the Tailor, together with the leftist movement Devrimci Yol, which translates as revolutionary path, and please, for the Turkish speakers that are listening, forgive my pronunciation. So together, the Sönmez, who was elected as mayor, together with the movement, Devrimci Yol, created people's committees to run many facets of the city government, notably developing and implementing infrastructure projects. In early 1980, Sönmez, so this is just a year after election, declared that his position of authority had been turned over to the democratic process. Today, he declared at the time, rather than a mayor, the public is in the administration of the municipality. The people of Fatsa manage themselves, he claimed. A few months later, after a mere 9 months in office, the mayor was arrested and tortured. At his trial, the military prosecutor alleged that he had created a Fatsa commune, reminiscent of the Paris Commune, a damning, if rather erudite charge in such an anti-communist context. The former mayor maintained in his defense that giving people a voice and making them decision makers in government, as he had done, was merely a basic requirement of democracy. Sönmez subsequently died in prison in 1985, 5 years after that. To understand how the fortunes of Fatsa, this small town on the Black Sea coast, and its mayor were reversed so radically and so rapidly, and moreover, how the improbable democratic experience came about in the first place, one has to back up and take account of the complex political situation of Turkey and the Turkish left in the 70s. The Fatsa experience was an anomaly in the political scene of the 70s in Turkey, but it helps illuminate two facts. First, the brief so-called Fatsa commune. Yeah, and I'm using this, I mean, it's the prosecutor who calls it a commune, not the people who are doing it, but I find it amusing nonetheless. Okay. In brief, the Fatsa commune was a manifestation of a profound desire for democratic participation on the revolutionary left, a symptom of what could have become more prevalent if the constant threat and reality of fascist violence had not been so intense. Second, without the dual strategy and double organization of Devrimci Yol, such a democratic experiment amidst the resistance struggles against fascists would not have been possible. In the second half of the 1970s, the Turkish revolutionary left was vibrant, but extraordinarily fractured and sectarian. A 1974 amnesty had freed many imprisoned leftists who flowed into myriad conflicting groups. A major division pitted those following the Soviet line against adherents of the Chinese line, but some organizations refused both sides of that conflict. Among them was Devrimci Yol, the one I'm talking about, the largest movement in the 70s and the one with the most popular support. Anti-fascist struggle was the central pillar of the party. And indeed, fascist violence was extraordinarily widespread and pressing threat in Turkey. The National Movement Party was a fascist presence in parliament, and the paramilitary Grey Wolves were violent action squads that targeted leftists along with ethnic and religious minorities, including Kurds and Alevis. Fascist violence, led primarily by the Grey Wolves, accounted for over 5,000 deaths in this period. In these areas of fiercest fascist terror, and here I'm quoting from an MA thesis by someone whose last name is Samin. Excuse me if I have that wrong. In these years of fiercest fascist terror, it was primarily the militants of Devrimci Yol who had to bear the brunt of the anti-fascist struggle and local self-defense. In some towns, half of the community was literally under fascist control, while the other half was defended by revolutionaries. End quote from Samim. The state, which had murky connections to the fascist groups, clearly could not be counted on to defend against them. In fact, as in Italy, the Turkish state pursued something like a strategy of tension in the 1970s. Along with the army, it allowed and even encouraged violent unrest so as to be able to justify its subsequent intervention to restore order and counter the purported communist threat. To defend communities against fascists, Devrimci Yol created throughout the country resistance committees. This is what they were called. And yeah, I guess I won't try giving you the Turkish because it would just embarrass me. Okay, so the Devrimci Yol created resistance committees throughout the country that were open to all. And these committees constituted the widest based and most outward-looking structures of the party. The party didn't have formal membership, but in particular through the resistance committees built a large following. Its organizational structure was designed to be narrow at the top and wide at the bottom. This was their slogan, to create the narrowest cadre within the widest mass. Devrimci Yol's 7-member central committee determined the political line and made strategic decisions. Below them was a general committee with an advisory role that included regional leaders and other key militants. And the base, including these resistance committees, was meant to be as large and open as possible. Corresponding to these different levels of political organization, Devrimci Yol developed 2 levels of armed organizations. The armed resistance forces, which were composed of resistance committees that I mentioned before. They were relatively decentralized and operated at a local level. Whereas the revolutionary war forces, a second militarized form, composed of professional revolutionaries, formed something like a guerrilla army and reported directly to the Central Committee. Devrimci Yol's most innovative political developments took place at its wide base. The military prosecutor facing the mayor, Mayor Sönmez, that I mentioned earlier, mayor of Fatsa, he was not the only one to see foreign ideas at work. Some Turkish leftists also viewed the democratic experiments operated at the committees of Devrimci Yol as out of place and un-Turkish. Militants who broke with Devrimci Yol in the late 70s and formed another party, Devrimci Sol, they called Revolutionary Left this time instead of Revolutionary Path, was the one I'm talking about mostly. They, for instance, some of the members of them accused the party I'm talking about most of creating a horizontal organization that they thought was better suited to the dominant capitalist countries. The practices of Devrimci Yol were not, in fact, derived from other countries, but I interpret this impression of foreignness, whether welcomed or not, as a mark of their originality. And these innovations didn't come from the narrow summit of Devrimci Yol, but its wide open horizontal base. To appreciate the nature of this base and the political dynamic created there, one has to look more closely at the anti-fascist resistance committees. In addition to combating fascists, the committees functioned as recruitment tools and as hubs of organization and theoretical education. Ultimately, when the fascist threat could be held in check, the resistance committees were intended to be transformed into democratic political projects. This is where it gets interesting for me. Specifically, Devrimci Yol used resistance committees as the basis for participatory institutions of self-governance, including neighborhood or municipal people's committees, as well as factory committees and student committees. The resistance committees were a gateway, in other words, that opened to democratic participation. Defending against fascists was, of course, essential. Without that, nothing else could be done. But the experience of our participation and cooperation in the resistance committees also served as a training in self-governance and created a desire for it. This is the political context that made possible the election of Fikri Sönmez and the Fatsa experiment in participatory democracy. Sönmez, a veteran leftist activist, allied with, but not a member of, Devrimci Yol, ran for mayor as an independent. For years before the election, Devrimci Yol had been active and gained popularity in the Fatsa area, in particular by leading one campaign to aid hazelnut growers, which is a major economic sector in the region, who had been exploited by merchants who offered low prices and usurious loans, and a second campaign to combat exploitation and hoarding in the black market economy. Okay, you can recognize these kind of struggles. The key factor was that fascists, although still a threat, were less powerful in Fatsa and the nearby region. So we're in the Black Sea region, northeast of Ankara, that fascists were less of a threat there than elsewhere. The fascists controlled only one neighborhood in Fatsa, which was something like an armed camp. Less energy required for anti-fascist defense meant more for constituting new democratic forms. Resistance committees could thus be transformed into people's committees. Upon his election in October 1979, Sönmez established in each of the 11 districts of the city a people's committee with frequent meetings open to all residents. The committees were designed to allow people to participate in government, and maybe I should even step. They conducted practical, popular, voluntary, participatory infrastructure projects having to do with roads, with improving infrastructure in all kinds of ways. These democratic experiments in Fatsa, however, were not given much room to breathe and grow. Turkish military troops entered Fatsa and took control of the city in July 1980, and the mayor was arrested the following month. The crackdown in Fatsa was, in some sense, a prelude. In September 1980, so months later, Turkey suffered the third coup d'etat in the history of the republic. The military claimed it had overthrown the government in order to put an end to political violence and restore order. And in the process, it executed dozens and imprisoned hundreds of thousands. The strategy of tension had in fact served its purpose and come to completion. In the end, perhaps, the military prosecutors charged that Mayor Sönmez, together with Devrimci Yol militants, had created a Paris commune on the Black Sea, was not completely off the mark. Yes, of course, provincial Fatsa is a far cry from metropolitan Paris, and the practical municipal improvements that they made were modest, but the essence of the commune, remember Marx saying this, it was its working existence, that is, its participatory governance structures that opened the possibility of a government of the people, by the people. Those were Marx's words about the Paris Commune. The People's Committee in Fatsa were precisely that. The real question is, what would the people of Fatsa have been able to create if their experiment had been given more than 9 months? Or perhaps more importantly, what kinds of participatory governance structures would Devrimci Yol and other revolutionary groups have been able to establish elsewhere in Turkey if they had not had to dedicate so much of their energies to defending against fascists? After all, the relatively low threat of fascists is what set Fatsa apart and made its experiments possible. What if all the resistance committees could be transformed into people's committees as institutions of participatory democracy? Such contrapositive conjecture may not be helpful because the fascists threatened Italy in the 1970s. Inside the state and outside the state was an ineluctable reality. What's certain, however, is that Devrimci Yol's multiple organizational structures allowed it, even in such an unfavorable environment, to organize participatory democratic experiences while accomplishing the necessary tasks of armed resistance. The Commune of Fatsa, although a small and brief experiment, is a significant demonstration of the political potentials opened by such a dual strategy.